The Vietnam War led to the greatest decade of film. So let's start with the First World War. I think one of the big things during this war was the idea it's going to be an adventure. That's how like the US government advertised it, and you could see this in various movies. For example, 1917. The structure of that movie is, you know, you're locked onto these character the entire time, and it creates this adventure, and even though, you know, it's a very horrible adventure where people die. And for the Second World War, these movies tend to focus around one character that does something extraordinary or goes through some crazy events, like Hacksaw Ridge with Andrew Garfield, or Saving Private Ryan. It's just this one character and they do something crazy even though they're a normal person or something. But what about the Vietnam War? Well, for Vietnam, I think the movies that are actually about the war tend to be anti-war movies. And I mean that by anti-war movies, not anti-war movies. The best example of this, and probably the best Vietnam War movie, would be Full Metal Jacket. Also, Full Metal Jacket is better than 2001: Space Odyssey. So Full Metal Jacket has two parts. One showing what the US government does to these soldiers, and then the second showing what these soldiers do to Vietnam. And I think that's what the anti-war movement largely focused on during the actual time Vietnam was going on. The other biggest Vietnam War movie would probably be Apocalypse Now, and this shows the carnage and how deadly and violent this war was. And the ideas of Vietnam War movies, they aren't just isolated in the 60s, 70s, 80s. We see, obviously, Vietnam War movies now. And I think the most recent and best example is actually Kong Skull Island. Skull Island takes place right after the Vietnam War. So we have Samuel L. Jackson's character, who's an officer leaving Vietnam, and in his eyes, you know, America had given up on the war, and this is making him like upset and leads to all the conflict, basically with him and King Kong. But I think one of the greatest lines of this movie is this one.
Keeps to himself mostly. This is his home. We're just guests here. Well, you don't go into someone's house and start dropping bombs unless you're picking a fight.
When you think of that, it's this, okay? It's America's, you know, bombing of not just the Viet Cong, but South Vietnam. And it's interesting because, you know, King Kong has always been an allegory for something. Like, originally he was an allegory for slavery. And even, you know, in who he faces off with in the newer movie Kong vs. Godzilla, or Godzilla vs. Kong, his buddy, or his enemy, whatever, Godzilla has also been an allegory for nuclear attacks. But anyways, back to Vietnam. Not all Vietnam movies are war movies. A great example of that is Taxi Driver. Of course, it follows a Vietnam veteran, and, you know, how his mental health was affected by this war, and how, you know, he's just thrown back in society and he can't deal with it. And it happens to be, you know, personally probably my second favorite movie. And another movie dealing with mental health made in the 70s was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson. This movie came from a book made in '63, but the movie was made in the 70s. It's focusing on the rising crisis of mental health, and people are starting to be more aware of mental health, but also there's a rise in mental health problems because of the war.
Well, you're not. You're not. You're no crazier than the average asshole out walking around on the streets, and that's it.
Now, I'll admit that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest isn't exactly a Vietnam War movie, but you know what is? Star Wars. Yes, the multi-billion franchise that takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away is a Vietnam War movie. Now this one's kind of actually less of a stretch because the creator has literally said that he's commenting on authoritarianism, and the Star Wars is anti-authoritarianism, and you know, that's what was happening at the time. Star Wars comes out in '77, and you can also see this partially in THX. George Lucas is basically his first movie. So there's all these movies made during this time that relate to the Vietnam War or are directly about it, and movies later on that are directly about the Vietnam War or have influence from it. Why are there so many of them, and why are they so great? I think it's because of the transition of movies and the transition of culture at this time. As far as the movies go, we see changes in the audience in return how movies are made and who they're made for. So going to the movies used to be something you dress up and it was something nice, and they were more targeted to a higher class. But this kind of goes away, you know, starting in the 60s. And the decade I'm talking about is the 70s. So going into the 80s, movies are much more commercialized, I would say, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But basically companies were changing who they were marketing these movies to, you know, because they realized teenagers are probably their best market. They have free time and disposable money. Anyways, you have the 70s, which is in between these two times, and it creates the perfect area for amazing movies to be made. And as far as the history goes, I think the major thing is people are asking about this war. Not to say people weren't asking about the previous wars, like why are we going into this, but once we were in this war, we were like, why are we here? What is this about? So people talking about this war leads to the creation of art. And before, the largest way to talk about war was usually music. You know, going all the way back to the Civil War, you know, there's so many songs written about every side of the war. And in the Vietnam War, music is big once again, but there's this new factor, there's movies. And movies become a way for people to talk about what's going on in the world. Overall, I think the 70s is largely considered the best decade of film, and I think the Vietnam War is a large cause in this, because the Vietnam War incited change in culture and people and how we talked about the world. Along with technology changes and audience changes in the film industry, we just get this perfect time period for great movies to be made. So yeah, Vietnam happened, and there's some good movies, and I just needed to rant about it. I'm also working on a movie that's an action movie, the Agent Batista movie, directed by myself, you know, involving lots of people. It's gonna be coming out this year. It's gonna be great. So yeah, you should check that out. See ya.